So this story takes place about 2 years ago, I think. I was working graveyard in a small town casino in the cafe on Halloween night. I was dressed up as Hermione because I'm a huge Harry Potter fan and my work has a Halloween contest, so I thought I would put myself out there, which I never do, mind you, and get in on the fun. Now, my outfit was a skirt, short, but I had short leggings on under it, and a polo shirt and a tie, and all Gryffindor themed. I'm on the cashier, and it's about 2 a.m, and we don't usually have any customers at this time, but since it's Halloween, we were busier than normal. So I'm just checking people out, just doing my job, actually having a good time seeing everyone dressed up, when this guy comes to the counter. I can tell immediately that he's drunk, and he was super tall, past 6 feet at least, and really buff and bald. I remember his total was like $2.40, and I don't know why I remember that, but I do, and anyways, he gave me a $100 bill. I told him that I had to get my manager to get change, and he looks at me and goes, "No, this is for you. I'll pay for the coffee separate." Now, as a cashier, we hardly ever get tips, but if someone wants to tip you, they can. But no one has ever tipped me this much before. So I was like, not really sure if he was being serious, and then he looks me up and down and says, "It's for you to come to my room with me." Well, I immediately hand the $100 bill back and say, "No, thank you." He takes out another $100 bill and throws them both at me and goes, "How about now?" I tell him no thank you again, and luckily security was close by and saw what was going on. He came over and nicely asked the guy to just pay for his coffee and leave, and the guy looks at the security guard and says, "If she's going to dress like a whore, she should act like one." At this point, I was very close to tears. I've had my fair share of creepy guys in my life, but never like this. Never in my face like this, and the security guy tells him to pay for his coffee and leave immediately, or he's going to be escorted out. The guy looks at me and says, "Okay, bitch, I'll wait for you outside. You better meet me outside or else." I'm just standing there, not really sure what to say or do because this guy was just so intimidating. The security guy tells this guy that this is a threat and calls the cops. The security guy tells him that this was a threat and calls the cops, and the guy goes crazy and tries to hit the security guy, but he missed and the security guy puts him by a wall and radios over to someone else to call the cops. So the creep keeps looking over at me saying things like, "Why do all whores act like this? At least I would have paid you," and "dumb bitch," and all that sort of stuff. This all happened so quick and escalated so quickly, and I felt like I barely had time to think, to be honest. At this point, I'm crying, and my co-workers take me to the back, and the cops come and arrest the guy. I guess he had punched a hole through the wall too and tried to hit one of the cops or something. The cops took my statement, and I was allowed to leave early. The same security guy walked me to my car too. I thanked him repeatedly too. Now, the fucked up thing is that, apparently, this guy was a huge spender at the casino, and the casino didn't even press charges or 86 him or anything. And after I heard about that, I quit soon after. This is an ongoing situation, but it just went from annoying to seriously creepy. There's a maintenance guy at the office building I work at. He's hired through the landlord of the building or something, not our company. Bob is an older guy, maybe late 50s, and a former heroin addict. I say it like this because we're all pretty sure that Bob still occasionally indulges in the habit. He's a really socially awkward guy, and his mannerisms and way of speaking are just strange. He talks really slow and pauses in places where pauses just don't make sense, or trails off mid-sentence or something, and he always gets super close too when he talks to you and makes intense eye contact or stares at me through our huge front window that happens to be in front of my desk. So, overall, just a mildly creepy guy. So, he's done some really weird things in the past too, like gave me his personal number, bought a coworker a $200 wedding gift and had it delivered to her, I work with all women. The staring of people through windows, and he gave me a toy riding horse thing for my son too. The kind that's on springs that rocks back and forth, and asks me personal questions about my marriage, and tried to ask me to go on a date with him at one stage. I also found my car door open and a bunch of my stuff like paperwork and some perfume and makeup that I keep in my center console moved around once when he was here. Today, he comes in the front office and just kind of stands there after saying hi. I ask my co-worker if I can go out and have a smoke, and she says yes, and I go get in my car and kept the door cracked so I could smoke. I was parked under a covered carport thing just outside the back door across from the utility and supply room, when all of a sudden, Bob is just standing there and kind of grabs the door and opens it a bit. I don't know where it came from, but I was listening to music, so I wasn't really paying attention. I took my headphones out and looked at him like, what? He doesn't answer right away and then asks if I can take him to the store. A, he has a big white truck that he knows that I know he has. And B, he knows damn well I can't just up and leave while I'm working. I tell him that, and he goes, no, it's okay, I already asked a co-worker and she said okay. I ask him why he can't just drive himself, and he sits there for a second and looks at me and then asks me to come help him with something in the utility room. I say no to this, and I need to get back in before I get yelled at. He stared at me for a minute and then smiles the creepiest fucking smile and says, no you won't. They think you took me to the store. We have plenty of time. I don't know if I'm accurately conveying the creepy scary vibe that he was putting off, but I was scared at this point. I didn't know what he wanted or what he was trying to accomplish, but I knew then that it wasn't anything good. And on top of that, he wasn't moving out of my way, and it was like 6 inches away from me. I tell him to move, and he stands there for a few seconds and finally moves. I dialed 911 on my cell and jumped out of the car and just ran inside because I seriously thought that he was going to grab me and push me into the utility room or something. But to be quite honest too, I'm still really shook about it. Oh, and he didn't ask a co-worker anything about the store too. He made that whole damn thing up. This guy is creepy as hell, and he left right after that whole thing, and I really don't know what to do about the whole situation. A few years back, I lived in an apartment complex. It wasn't in a bad part of town or anything, and I even lucked out, somehow managing to move into the same building as a handful of friends of mine. I thought it was pretty awesome. So, a couple of months after living there, I noticed things were missing though. It was never anything big like my laptop or Xbox, but my iPad or camera and a couple of other small things just vanished. I knew I'd left them out in the open on the counter, but then they were just gone. A few times, I'd get ready to leave and my bottom lock would be locked too. Now, personally, I don't put much stock into doorknob locks. They've always seemed really flimsy to me and not worth the effort, to be honest, so I only ever use my deadbolt. When people would come over, I'd close the door behind them and automatically lock the deadbolt too. It was just a reflex, even when I was home alone, and the door was locked, but never the knob. I felt even safer using it because the deadbolt had no keyhole on the outside of the door for someone to pick or anything. And 3 times the doorknob was locked when I went to leave the house, and even though I never used it, I rationalized that sure, I probably just did lock it myself. I mean, what else could it be, right? But one day, after living there for about 7 months, I'd say, I'm sitting in my living room and I hear some shuffling by my front door. But since my apartment was a 1-bedroom and fairly small, I could hear it easily. I got up and moved closer, standing maybe 4 feet away from it. My heart sank as I watched my doorknob twist, just ever so slowly. It turned and then the door pushed in and stopped at my deadbolt. At an agonizingly slow pace, the person on the other side pulled it closed and the door just softly clicked, and I watched and listened as they slid a key into my lock and locked the doorknob. I didn't know what to do. I mean, Have you ever seen something that just restarts your brain like that? It's so unfathomable that you just can't take in any of the information. That's what this was. I wish I could say that I snuck up to the door and banged against it, scaring the shit out of whoever was on the other side, but I didn't. I didn't do anything because my brain just couldn't actually comprehend that someone with a key was trying to get into my apartment while I was home. The only thing that saved me was my deadbolt. And before anyone says it was a friend or my husband with a spare, no. I had the only 2 copies, or so I thought, of my key because my husband was deployed. Not even family had a spare. But everything snapped into place after that. Someone had definitely been sneaking into my apartment and stealing shit and doing God knows what while I was gone, and then relocking the door behind them, and they've attempted to do it while I was there, too, locking my doorknob. I mean, how many times had they been in my apartment when I wasn't home? But there was no way for me to know because, like I said before, I can't lock the deadbolt from outside. Logically, I knew it had to be someone who worked in the office, a maintenance man most likely, but since I didn't look through the peephole, I couldn't find out which of the 4 guys who worked there it was. About 6 months after moving out, a friend who still lived there told me that all the maintenance men had been fired because all of them were reported creeping around apartments and likely suspected of stealing shit. To this day, I'm still not sure which maintenance man it was that came to my door, but to think that multiple of them were sneaking around apartments, it's creepy. Back when I was 14 or 15, I hung around with a sizable group of friends. We would meet up in what we called the field, which basically was a large park in the middle of a residential area which backed onto a cemetery. On one side was an imposing hotel with large grounds, and on the other was a fenced-in wasteland. We hung around towards the back of the field, which was surrounded by trees and bushes, so visibility was pretty much nil from the street. Added to that is that it was very poorly lit, so we would build bonfires at night to provide light and whatnot, and warmth in the winter. During the day, large gangs of us would come and go, and we'd head to the shops or play curbs on the street. A local weirdo would often walk by too, looking back over his shoulder at us every few seconds and immediately averting his gaze if eye contact was made. He would shuffle around the corner, only to reappear at regular intervals. He was just an absolute creep, and this was displayed in his physicality. He was short and of slim build, balding with tufts of long hair creeping down the nape of his neck. As previously described, he would walk in a shuffle motion too, stopping abruptly and turning around to watch us. His eyes darted all over the place too, and he never made direct eye contact. But being teens and with the bravado of safety in numbers, we never really viewed him as a threat though. The lads would roar at him and call him a perv and a pedo and tell him to fuck off, but we gave him little thought otherwise, to be honest. One night though, around November or December, I arranged to meet some friends in the field after dinner. Around this time of year in Ireland, it's pretty much pitch black by 4 p.m, and it was 6:45ish and I was 15 minutes early. The field was dark and empty, but with the fearlessness and naivety of youth, I strolled to our usual spot at the back of the park to wait. Keep in mind that this was around 95 or 96, pre everyone having a mobile phone. We had a custom little hut in one of the bushes, complete with branches that we used as seats. I settled on one of them and lit a smoke, and all was silent for several minutes until I heard a slight rustling in one of the bushes. I was slightly concerned, but figured that it must have just been a squirrel. The rustling stopped for several moments, but then picked up again, and louder and more vigorous. Definitely not the work of a squirrel. Alarmed, I shot up from my seated position and tried to make out the source of the noise in the dim visibility. Out of nowhere, though, he emerged from the bushes. Pounced would be more accurate, actually, and he was just mere feet away from me. He stared directly at me with the most menacing grin that I've ever witnessed to this day. He put his finger to his lips in a shushing gesture, and I bolted. Through the bushes, branches just whipping against my face. I stumbled at one point too, catching myself before I fell. I ran out of the fucking park in what felt like slow motion at the time, straight to my house about a half a kilometre away. I don't know if he followed me because I didn't look back and I didn't see him again. As I later learned, though, he spent several years in a mental facility. Because the next I heard of him, he had apparently murdered his father, beating and eventually stabbing him to death. He was convicted of the murder and detained in a mental facility, and I thought little about him for the 20 or so years since that incident. That is, until a few months back, because there he was, on my bus, gazing around creepily like always. He looked my way, but luckily there was no recognition on his part. At least, I hope not. This happened a little bit ago, about a month, and it was a bizarre experience to say the least. I'm 15 and I was playing some video games before passing out, and it was about, say, 11 p.m. when I hear the doorbell ring. Out of instinct, I began walking downstairs, but about halfway, rationality came to mind. I mean, who the fuck rings a doorbell at 11 p.m., right? I silently strode back upstairs and stood in the hall, kind of expecting something bad to happen. And an exact minute later, it rings twice. My parents begin to leave their room and give me a quizzical look, and all I had was a shrug for a response. Then, he starts banging on the door. My mother jumps up at the first bang, and my father's eyes widen, but more in confusion than fear. He decided to go downstairs and peep through the view hole, and it was our neighbour. My dad hesitantly opened the door, and I could hear my father's voice tremble slightly. Hey, what do you need? Next thing I hear is an entire full-blown scream argument from my neighbour, claiming that this household was his and that we stole it from him. My father's uneasiness was quickly replaced with annoyance, and he simply shut the door without giving our neighbour the time of day. My dad stepped on the first step going up the stairwell when our neighbour first hit the door. I'm not talking banging with a fist. This man was full body slamming it. My father was stunned for a second, and my neighbour charged the door again. This time, we began to hear the splintering of the wood too, and everyone reacted at once. My father went to brace the door with his body, my mother went to get the two other kids, and I went for 911. But the body slamming ensued for about 5 minutes too, and while I was on the phone with 911, mind you, it stopped. I thought it was over at that point, and to be honest, I was relieved, but I still stuck on the phone for a bit. I go peek out the front window of my house, and boy, was it only getting started. Our neighbour took his Jeep Wrangler and simply directed it straight at our house. We had zero clue what he was doing until he hit the gas and we heard the squealing of the tyres, and then he immediately hit the brakes. He was trying to scare us out of the house, I think, and I was still on the phone with 911, and I stepped away from the window to comfort my siblings, crack jokes and such, and eventually the police arrived and arrested him. The next morning, I left for school, still shaken from the night before, and I stepped onto our front steps and saw tyre marks leading up to our front door. In other words, the lunatic actually nearly rammed our door down with his car. I really never want to see this guy again, but he lives directly right next to me, so fuck my life. This happened about 4 years ago. Some backstory first. I'm from Australia and lived there during this event. At the time, my girlfriend, now wife, lived in another country but was visiting me over Christmas break. I lived in a big city which, if you drove about an hour in any direction, would either lead to another city or beautiful nature, in my opinion anyway. But my friends and I decided to take my girlfriend at the time to see some of this beautiful nature and decided on a national park about an hour and a half from where we lived. This place is definitely no sort of secret location and it's pretty well known, but there are a ton of different areas to it. all with different rural and windy roads that take you to various areas of the park. We had gone in 2 different cars too, my friends in one and me and my girlfriend in the other, to have some time together. So, we finished out the day of hiking and were heading home down one of the less common roads, and I remember seeing this really beat-up old 70 sedan with a wild-looking dude in the driver's seat drive past us in the other direction. This wasn't uncommon, as there are a lot of smaller, less economically sound towns spattered around the area, but for some reason, him and his car just stood out, and my girlfriend noticed it as well. About 200 meters further down the very windy road, there was a pull-off area. Just a semicircle of gravel that you could pull off to look at the view towards the ocean and whatnot. There was a camper van belonging to a company that mostly rented out colourful vans to backpackers parked there, with a woman just standing in front of it. And as soon as she sees us, she jumps out onto the road and flags us down. Now, these days, I've read enough things to know that pulling over to help someone on a quiet road might not be the safest idea, but back then I hadn't, and my friends were in the car directly behind us. Luckily, she wasn't the person that I didn't want to meet. She was quite obviously upset and scared when we pulled in, and I told my girlfriend to wait in the car, and I got out to speak to her. She was almost in tears, and I can't remember exactly where she was from, but it was a Central European country from memory, touring around with her 4 or 5-year-old daughter or something. She told me that her van had broken down and she pulled off there and called the van company's assistance line and was waiting for help. By this time, my friends had pulled in behind us and a couple of them had come over to see what was up. So apparently, a scary man had driven past her a few times already, the first time pulling over to offer to take her and her daughter to the nearest town for help. She thanked him and said no, and that she was just waiting for the assistance vehicle. He left, but then kept driving past every 10 to 15 minutes in the opposite directions, slowing down and then looking at them and then driving off again. She begged us to stay with her while she waited for the assistance vehicle because this guy apparently terrified her and her daughter too. I agreed, and my friends, being the awesome people that they are, decided that me and my girlfriend were enough, and they just fucking ditched us. Thanks, guys. Anyway, we stayed with the woman for a little while before the car that my girlfriend and I had seen earlier drove past kind of slow, coming in the opposite way that we had seen him the first time. As soon as he had driven around the bend, the lady told us too that was the scary man that she'd been seeing before we got there. This got my girlfriend and I to take her much more seriously after the feeling we got from the guy just seeing him on the road. A few minutes later, he came back from the other direction and pulled into the parking area. There's some more context too. I am not an intimidating man. I'm tallish, I'll admit, but I have almost zero muscle and fairly soft features. So there's not at all intimidating me, a terrified foreign woman, her tiny daughter, and my girlfriend, who doesn't look that intimidating but is tough as nails, mind you, parked off a quiet road in a rural location with a not-so-nice-looking dude pulling in where we were. Great, I thought. So he gets out and is redneck as hell and definitely not friendly-looking. No judgment on the redneck part. I come from a poorer country town north of our city, and those are my people, but hopefully that sets a picture. Anyway, he strolls over to us, and at this point, I walk towards him to put myself between the girls and him. I have no idea where this bravery came from, and I would definitely not describe myself as a brave person normally. He looks at the girls and then me and asks if he could help. I tell him no, we're just waiting for the assistance vehicle, and tell him that we've got it covered. He then says that maybe he could stay and wait with the woman and her daughter so that we don't have to. I tell him that we're happy to stay and thank him, but again, we've got it covered. He kind of just stood there for a while, staring at all of us too, and not really saying anything and just giving off mega creepy vibes. After what seemed like forever, another car drove past us and looked out but just kept going. And this seemed to startle him, and he mumbled good luck and got in his car and just drove off. We waited with this poor scared woman and her daughter for almost 90 minutes and ended up talking a lot, and hopefully we made her opinions of Australians a little brighter after Mega Creep. who drove past once more about 15 minutes after he'd left us too, mind you. Finally, the assistance vehicle arrived, a bigger dude who could definitely handle himself. I asked to see his ID and stuff to be safe, but he was in a car marked by the company, had all his tools and definitely seemed legit. We gave the lady my number and asked her to text me when she was off safe. She was so grateful to us for staying with her for such a long time, and it made me feel good that even if this dude was just a weirdo-looking awkward country guy that didn't mean any harm and was really just trying to help, we still made her feel more comfortable in a strange country. Mind you, I don't think he was just an innocent bystander, and I definitely believe that he was up to something. But I guess you never know. In the end, I did get a message from her to say that she was safe, so everything ended pretty well. But being up in those mountains where pretty much no one goes and having this weird guy just drive past continuously, almost leering at these girls too, it was a creepy experience, to say the least. In 2007, I was a freshman going on sophomore in college, and my brother, Martin, was still in high school. We have 2 much younger siblings too, so at the time, they were around elementary school age. My parents decided to take a cruise for their 20th wedding anniversary that year, so my brother and I were voluntold to watch my younger brother and sister, Cole and Charlotte. My brother's best friend, Christian, stayed with us while my parents were gone, and he helped us plan some fun activities with the younger siblings. One idea that they were particularly excited about was a camping trip, as my family had never been particularly outdoorsy in the past. Their eyes lit up at the prospect of cooking our dinner over a campfire and fishing in the stream. Since it was early summertime too, we had the great luck of warm but not too hot weather and a beautiful clear sky for stargazing. Finally packed and ready for the somewhat long drive to the mountains, we checked into our campsite before dark, and Cole and Charlotte helped us to set up the tent. It was strange, but there were no other people at the campground, which was unusual for this time of year. But once we finished dinner, the younger brother and sister were ready for sleep, so Martin, Christian and I just stayed awake a little longer catching up and getting things ready for the next morning. Suddenly, a white Astro van pulled up in the camping spot directly next to ours. He had dozens to choose from, mind you, but chose to park right next to us. Christian just said, "Oh well, at least we have company now," and he called out a quick hello to the new neighbor with no response back. At this point, I got an uneasy feeling almost immediately, but decided to just push it aside and continued to get the fishing poles ready for the morning and put the food away for the night to ward off bears and wild animals and whatnot. Over the next hour or so, things just started to get weird though. So, the man who parked next to us got out of his van to sit at the picnic table with only a small fire. From our roaring fire, I could see that he was looking directly at us too. However, his fire died out completely several minutes later, and he continued just sitting there. And I could feel him staring, but I couldn't see his face anymore, and he was just sitting there, breathing. Christian and Martin noticed that I was uneasy, and they picked up on how creepy the situation started to become. Martin whispered, "Why is he breathing like that? I don't feel safe anymore." I told Christian and Martin that I was going to stay awake because I just didn't trust this guy. As soon as they moved from the fire into their tents, the man rose from the picnic table and started moving towards us. I called out, "Hello," with no response from him, and finally, in a whim of panic, I demanded that we pack up and just get the fuck home immediately. Christian and Martin got out of their tents and saw the figure of the man just standing there, staring at us, breathing hard. We tried to stay as quiet and as calm as possible while we packed up so as not to alarm Cole and Charlotte. And finally, throwing everything in the trunk, we drove away, not looking back. Before leaving the site itself, though, I asked if we could go to the check-in area at the lodge to see what the hell was going on and see if they knew anything more. I mean, what was this guy's deal, right? But to my surprise, there was no one else registered at the campsite that evening. But the story doesn't end there too. So, about 6 months later, I think, I was in my sophomore year of school when a local hiker went missing in a county just over from where we camped and where I went to college. She was doing something really normal, like hiking with a dog or something, and sadly, she turned up several months later murdered and found in a white Astro van. When the news finally released the photos of the van too and the man's face, I knew immediately that it was him. I got a phone call from both my brother and his friend, and they recognized him too. But we came to find out too that this wasn't his first murder, because several years later, he became known as the National Forest serial killer. I sincerely mean it when I say that I'm an incredibly cautious camper now because of this encounter. I mean, thinking that it could have been us or my younger siblings, it still gives me nightmares to this day. But we recently had a reunion actually, Christian, Martin and I, and we talked about what happened to us with more than 10 years gone by now. It's amazing that we all remember the details so clearly too. They're just etched in our memories forever now, I think.